Hello YouTube, hope you're having a great day today. Today I want to take a look at one of Lord Dunsany's works, a second one. This one we're going to be looking at the King of Elfland's daughter. Specifically we're going to be looking at this book when it comes to where it comes from, where the influences are, and so forth. This book, or The Gods of Pegana, which I've already reviewed for you already, are generally considered to be one of Lord Dunsany's strong classic fantasy works. Both of them are kind of in the debate for the best that he wrote. This one is certainly considered by many to be one of the best fantasy novels ever written. Certainly one of the most influential fantasy novels ever written. We'll talk about how it's influenced many major writers and pieces that are still coming out today, like Neil Gaiman, and movies that have come out. Princess Bride, Stardust, stuff like that, all definitely comes from Lord Dunsany and the King of Elfland's daughter. So we're going to take a look at that. As a reminder, Lord Dunsany, and I'll give you a link in the comments below to my first review of a Dunsany work, which is The Gods of Pegana. But Lord Dunsany is this Irish nobleman from a peerage, from a high-level estate. He is living in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and he has written a number of heavily influential works. He is somebody who is able to publish what he wants with his own money rather than what the public was expecting. He creates a storyline called The Gods of Pegana, which basically creates a mythos for a world that he creates called Pegana, wherein he writes in a sort of pseudo Old English King James Bible style of a language. He creates all these mythic characters and myth arcs and stuff. And that's in the story of The Gods of Pegana. And The Gods of Pegana is considered heavily influential. And many writers that followed, like J.R.R. Tolkien, or among others, would take that sort of idea of world building, building up all your gods, building up your mythos, building up your world like he did. And I would say that, pretty much modern fantasy RPGs are just like, literally like The Gods of Pegana, taken with a creation myths, characters, spells, gods, interactions, myths, and legends and such. So even a modern RPG, Dungeons & Dragons rules book or world guide or something like that, they're all going to read like The Gods of Pegana, which was written a long time ago. So it's heavily influential. I consider it to be a great book. And in my opinion, it's actually the better of these two books. But if you're looking for a more traditional sort of story, then The King of Elfland's Daughter is where you're going to want to look. And again, this thing was written in the early 1920s. It's a strong read. Lord Dunsany is not going to keep you up that late. This book itself is probably clocking in about 250 pages total in oversized print, but the print in my copy of it's bigger than a normal book would be like this, which makes it a little easier to read and such. But Lord Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter is heavily influential, again, just like a Tolkien and others, and its reputation has kind of continued to rise. After he wrote it, it was not considered one of these great classic works and so forth, but over time it became more and more influential. I think that would be kind of like Stairway to Heaven or Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin was not hitting the top 40, not a hugely influential band when you look at the hits and so forth, but over time Led Zeppelin's reputation has increased as people talk about how it influenced them and so forth. So Led Zeppelin's reputation has increased over time, and Stairway to Heaven is considered this classic rock song that many people love, even though it barely hit the top 40, and many other classic rock songs hit a lot higher than that. So I think in a very, very real way, Lord Dunsany's like Led Zeppelin, and this is Stairway to Heaven, if that makes sense. And I consider it to be one of the most important fantasy novels ever written, which is why we're reviewing it for a channel that looks at unpacking all these great hidden treasures you may not have ever heard of. So let's take a look at The King of Elfland's Daughter, and then talk a little bit about its influences. So the novel itself is trying to, it's set in this kingdom where the king has received the request from his people, and there's this sort of tradition in his fantasy kingdom that the people will have an opportunity to kind of influence the kingdom and so forth, and they are interested in having a magic person lead them. So he charges his son with going to the elf kingdom and then to win the princess of the king of Elfland and bring her back. So after to successfully woo her, bring her back to the kingdom. That's actually going to happen early on in the story, and then there's going to be a lot of follow-up stuff that happens too. I don't want to spend too much time with that because, again, I don't want to have. I try to keep my reviews relatively spoiler-light. But it does go into some incredible detail about the the wooing of the princess and all the various things that are happening when when it comes to that in Elfland. And then of course after bringing her back, there's going to be issues and such. They'll have a child, and there's going to be issues with her. You can expect this. There's going to be issues with her acclimating to the human world and such. And then the follow-up storyline that happens, which takes up probably more than half the book. So that's the story, and it's incredibly well done. It's incredibly effective. Everybody from the King of Elfland himself to the King of the Human Kingdom to our main characters, the daughter and the prince and others that follow are all very well done. None of them are good guys or bad guys, like a traditional sort of storyline where you might have like King of Elfland who might be considered this antagonist or something like that. Actually, they're not, which makes it pretty interesting. He definitely cares for his people and his ultimate way of sort of handling the situation that has emerged when his daughter has left is, I think, very self-sacrificial and very nice. And I think Lord Dunsany comes up with a very good solution to this story. So it's good stuff, and it gets 250 pages long. It's not going to keep you up all night. It took me, I've read it now twice. It took me, I think, about 3 or 4 hours the first time I read it through, and the second time I read it through just before posting this review. I read it through this time about 2.5 hours because I'm more used to Lord Dunsany's writing style. I've read a lot more of his books now, short stories and such, and Gods of Pagana and other stuff like that. Whereas this was initially one of my first sort of books that I wrote, read by Lord Dunsany, but now I'm more used to his writing style. Again, it's considered a classic. It's heavily influential. It has this fairy tale fantasy style of writing, which was something that was going to become very popular. Eventually, it's going to be seen as its own genre, where this sort of fairy tale fantasy is going to be kind of a subgenre of fantasy. It was not at the time. So this is kind of be one of basically the novels that kind of puts that on the planet, much like Lord of the Rings puts heroic fantasy, that sort of epic fantasy with the classic good versus evil, fighting for the entire world itself. That sort of epic, classic heroic fantasy is really put on the map by Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or the anti-heroes of fantasy really put on the map by Moorcock's Eternal Champion, and particularly his Elric of Melniboné series, and so forth. And in a similar way, fairy tale fantasy is really sort of given space to breathe with this. And so any sort of fairy tale fantasy set in sort of a medieval world with kings and sort of light fantasy narratives, elves, magic, wishes, and stuff like that is going to, fairies and stuff, is going to sort of follow in this tradition, and going to be in a sort of Dunsany, King of Elfland daughters sort of style of writing. And a perfect example of this is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman was open about, really being inspired by this novel when it came to coming to writing Stardust and so forth. And so if you like Stardust or the movie, the novel by Neil Gaiman, or if you've read pretty much anything by Neil Gaiman, pretty much half of Neil Gaiman's stuff is in this sort of fairy tale fantasy narrative, with a lot of his comics, his books, his movie scripts and stuff are all kind of in this sort of genre. So if you enjoyed that part of Neil Gaiman, then this is where that sort of fantasy sort of thing really kind of hung its hat, and it's very strong. It's very compelling and very enjoyable. So that's Lord Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter, in very just short terms. It's very much something that's grown its reputation over time. It was published in the 60s, again, as part of this sort of common fantasy for everybody Ballantine adult fantasy series. And once it was published in the mid-60s, its reputation really grew, particularly with fans of the 60s that were growing up with fantasy, or 70s, that were growing up with fantasy that may not have actually have been around in the 20s, or reading actively in the 20s to enjoy it. Particularly the first generation of Dungeons & Dragons players, gamers and such. I really loved it. It's in Gary Gygax's Appendix N. It's one of the most influential writers and novels for creating the world and kind of the rules of Dungeons & Dragons and its narrative and such. So there are a lot of these sort of great things that are happening out there that I think are really strong, incredibly well done, and crafted and such. So I think kudos to all these various things that are out there that are happening. But again, it's a strong read, and I would encourage it to anybody because again, when you're the first of these sort of books that writes a new genre or really will sort of codify it, you have the opportunity to be yourself. When Neil Gaiman was writing Stardust, he couldn't write Stardust without knowing about the King of Elfland's daughter, and in fact he's influenced by it. He writes in the vein of the King of Elfland's daughter. Many of the things, many of the narratives, many of the ideas, and so forth from this novel are in Stardust. He can't write Stardust. You can't write something now without it being sort of in this Princess Bride, modern readers from Princess Bride, or this older sort of person who created it, Lord Dunsany in this story, where he really popularizes it. But you can absolutely do it when you're doing it by yourself, letting it do what the story demands and what you want the story to demand. And so that's one of the great things that Lord Dunsany kind of brings with a lot of these firsts, is that he is able to just let the story be the story, which is just so compelling and awesome. So if you have never heard of it before, it's heavily influential. It's incredibly well crafted. It's still a strong read today. This is the King of Elfland's daughter. If, on the other hand, you have read it, tell me what you think. I'll give you a link in the comments below in case you're interested in checking it out and reading it. Very quickly over from Amazon or something like that. If you've read it, let me know what you think. In the comments below, did you agree or disagree? I'm happy to engage you with that. If you like this video, there's no reason not to hit that subscribe button down there, just like every YouTube video ends. But I'd appreciate it if you actually did that. Take some time out of your day to hit that there subscribe button. Also, again, I appreciate that you took some time out of your day to spend about 12 minutes with me. We all have busy lives, and the fact that you spent some with me, that's very touching, and I really appreciate that. So thank you so much. Once again, you have a great day.